For 30 years, my sisters told everyone I got nothing when our mother died. A box of old notebooks, diaries, they called them. They kept the restaurant, the name, the recipes on the wall. And they were right about one thing. I got nothing anyone could see. But the day the bank called, it wasn't my sisters they asked for. It was the woman who bussed their tables. It was me. She was closing up when I got there, and she told me the coffee would be bad because it always was, and I should drink it anyway. I'd come in with a notebook and a list of questions, the way you do when you're young and you think a story is a thing you collect. My editor had sent me to find the last person who remembered the real Maman Odette's, the little restaurant near the edge of Tremé that turned into a name you saw in every airport in Louisiana, before it collapsed and took a bank's money down with it. They'd told me there was an old cook who used to work there. Nobody said much more than that. She was wiping down the counter when I walked in, long, slow strokes with a gray rag, the way a person does it when their hands have done it 10,000 times and stopped needing the mind at all. She didn't look up right away. She just kept moving that rag, and she said, "Sit anywhere, sugar. The good stool's the one that don't wobble." I asked her about the brand, the cookbooks, the franchise, the bankruptcy everybody read about in the paper. And she laughed, a dry little sound, like a screen door. "Everybody prints the same story," she said. "And every one of them puts the restaurant in the middle of it, like the restaurant was the point." She set 2 cups down between us, both chipped, both filled with coffee so dark it looked like the bottom of the river. "It wasn't about a restaurant," she said. "It was about a box." I asked her what was in the box. She didn't answer that. Not yet. She wrapped her hands around her own cup, old hands, strong hands. Flour worked so deep into the knuckles it had stopped washing out years ago. And she looked at me for a long moment, the way you look at somebody you've decided to trust before you've decided why. "You want to know how a bankruptcy lawyer ends up calling a woman who cleaned tables for a living," she said. "You want to know how somebody who inherited nothing ended up owning everything." I said yes. That's exactly what I wanted to know. She nodded slowly. Out the window behind her, the street was still wet from the afternoon storm, the streetcar wires black against a gray sky, the live oaks dripping. Somewhere a pot was ticking on a burner. "Then you have to start where I started," she said. "At the bottom of my mother's stove." My mother made her roux with her back to us, and she never once turned around, because she said the color would lie to you if you looked away. She stood at that cast-iron range every morning of my childhood, a wooden spoon worn to a curve in her right hand, moving flour and oil through a heavy black pot for the better part of an hour. Slow. Always slow. She said the difference between a good gumbo and a great one was 50 minutes a fool wouldn't wait through. She'd tap the spoon on the rim, one tap, always one, and she'd say, "Chocolate, Delphine, not peanut butter. Anybody stops at peanut butter, they're in a hurry. And a hurry is a kind of lying, too." I was the one who listened when she said things like that. That's the first thing you need to understand about my family. There were 3 of us, and only one of us was ever really listening. The restaurant was called Maman Odette's, after her, and it sat in a narrow Creole townhouse on the edge of Tremé, pale yellow stucco going gray at the corners, green shutters, a wrought iron balcony with ferns that dripped on your head if you stood in the wrong spot. Inside it was small, 12 tables, a window fan that pushed the heat around without ever taking it anywhere. In the summer, that kitchen ran 90 degrees before the first customer sat down, and my mother stood in the middle of it like it was nothing, like the heat was just another thing she'd outlasted. We were 3 daughters, and if you'd watched us for 1 hour on any ordinary day, you'd have known exactly who each of us was going to become. My mother used to say you could read a person by what they did in a kitchen when they thought nobody was grading them. Colette was the oldest, 30 when this part of the story happens. She stood at the register, not because Mama put her there, because that's where Colette put herself. She counted the day's cash twice, morning and night, and she had a way of looking at the dining room that I didn't understand as a girl and understood too well later. She wasn't looking at people eating. She was looking at tables turning. Money coming and money going. To Colette, even then, the room was a business wearing the costume of a home. Marguerite was the middle one, 28. She worked the front, and Lord, she was good at it. She could make a table of tourists from Ohio feel like they were the most interesting people who'd ever walked into New Orleans. She remembered names, remembered which of them liked their coffee with chicory and which one thought chicory was a punishment. She could sell. Marguerite could sell you a bowl of red beans like she was doing you a favor letting you pay for it. And then there was me, Delphine, 22, and on my knees most of the time, scrubbing the flat top with a pumice stone while the grease was still warm, because Mama said cold grease was a stubborn enemy. I was the baby, the sentimental one. That's what they called me. Gentle enough, the way you call a slow child sweet. Del's got a soft heart. Del cries at the radio. Del'll never leave home. They weren't wrong about the soft heart, but there was one thing about me nobody in that family ever counted, because it didn't count for anything yet. I was the only one who ever asked my mother why. Why the Trinity, onion, celery, bell pepper, always in that order, never garlic in the base. Why she salted the water and not the roux. Why she'd wave a hand over a pot and say, "That one's done," a full 3 minutes before it looked done to me. And why, this is the one that matters, why, after we closed every night, she sat down at the cypress table in the back with a stack of oilcloth notebooks and wrote. She wrote her recipes down by hand, in fountain pen, blue-black ink, in a cursive so tight and even it looked printed. And at the top of every single one, before she wrote a word of the recipe itself, she wrote the date. I asked her once. I was maybe 10. I climbed up beside her at that table and I watched her write March 14th at the top of a page for a crawfish étouffée she'd been making my whole life. And I said, "Mama, you already know how to make it. Why are you writing the day?" She didn't stop writing. She just said, "Because one day, Delphine, somebody is going to stand in a nice room in a nice dress and say this was theirs." She underlined the date once. And a date doesn't lie. People lie. Memory lies. Sisters. And she stopped herself, and she smiled a little, sad, and she said, "A date doesn't lie. That's all. You remember that." I didn't know what she meant. I was 10. But I remembered it. I remembered all of it, the way you remember the things you don't understand until the day you finally do. There's one more thing I remembered, and I want you to hold on to it, because everybody in this story forgot it, except me. When I was a girl, my mother used to take me by the hand on certain Saturday afternoons and walk me down toward Rampart Street to a small office with a brass plate on the door. Inside, there was a man at a desk with a strange little machine, and my mother would hand him a page from her notebook, and he'd look at it, and he'd set it in that machine and press down hard with both hands, and when he lifted it, there'd be a mark pressed right into the paper. A raised ring. A seal. You could feel it with your thumb. I asked her what the man did. She said, "He makes it true." That's the words she used. He makes it true. She was having her recipes notarized. dated and notarized, page by page, year after year. A woman with a 6th-grade education who cooked in 90-degree heat, quietly building a legal record of exactly who wrote what and exactly when, in a state where, more than any other in this country, a dated document with a notary's seal on it carries a weight the law respects. Louisiana's not like the rest of America. Our law came down a different river, the Napoleonic Code, the civil law. A notary here isn't just somebody who watches you sign. A notary here can make a thing stand up. My mother knew that. I don't know how she knew it, a woman like her, but she knew it, and she did it, and none of it meant a thing to anybody but her, least of all to my sisters. Colette and Marguerite thought the notebooks were Mama being Mama. Fussy. Sentimental, that word again. The one they liked to hang on me. To them, the recipes lived on the cards taped up by the range, splattered and grease-soft, the ones the cooks actually used. Those cards were the restaurant. The notebooks were just Mama's diary, her little hobby. They never once walked her to Rampart Street. They never watched the man press down with both hands. They never felt that raised ring under their thumb. I did, and I never forgot the words. He makes it true. The last good year was 1975. By then, Mama had a cough she'd wave off, the kind that lives in a woman who's breathed rue smoke and window fan heat for 40 years. She'd stop stirring for a second, press the back of her wrist to her mouth, and then keep stirring, because in her mind, stopping was a bigger risk than the cough. She got thin. Her wedding ring turned loose on her finger, and she wrapped a bit of thread around it to keep it on. She kept writing at night, kept dating the pages. Toward the end, she wrote slower, and one night I saw her write a date and then just sit there with the pen resting on the paper, looking at nothing. And I understood, the way children suddenly understand a thing all at once, that she was running out of days to date. She never told us she was dying. She wasn't the kind. But she started keeping me later than the others. She'd send Colette home to count the money, and Marguerite home to rest her feet, and she'd keep me back to help close. And closing got slower and slower, until it was mostly the two of us sitting at that cypress table, not saying much. The window fan turning, the ferns dripping outside in the dark. One of those last nights, she put her hand flat on the stack of notebooks, just rested it there. And she looked at me, and she said, "You listen better than they count, baby. Don't you fight your sisters over me when I'm gone. Promise me that. Don't you fight them." I promised. I'd have promised her anything. I just didn't understand that night what I was really promising. That I would stand still for 30 years while people took what was ours and never say a word. Because a dying woman had asked me not to fight. None of us knew it yet. But everything my sisters would ever own, and everything I would ever be given, was already written down, dated, sealed, and stamped with a mark none of them ever once bothered to feel with their thumb. The lawyer's office smelled like other people's grief, and my sisters had already decided who was getting what before he opened the folder. My mother died in the spring of 1976, on a Tuesday, in the back bedroom of the house she'd raised us in, with the window fan turning because she'd asked for it. She went the way she cooked, slow, quiet, and without turning around to see who was watching. We buried her out of St. Augustine, and half of Tremé came, and Colette wore black so well you'd have thought she'd picked it out for the occasion months ahead. Marguerite cried in a way that people noticed. I cried in a way that people didn't. 2 weeks after, a lawyer's office off Canal Street. A small room. A ceiling fan that turned too slow to move any air. Just enough to keep the heat honest. 3 sisters in 3 chairs. and a man named Mr. Pertwee behind a desk with a folder he hadn't opened yet. Colette sat forward. Marguerite sat pretty. I sat with my hands in my lap, and I already felt, the way you feel weather coming, that something had been settled in a conversation I wasn't part of. Because they'd talked. Of course they'd talked. In the 2 weeks between the funeral and that office, Colette and Marguerite had done what Colette and Marguerite always did. They'd counted the room and divided it up between them. I heard pieces of it through walls. Colette knew what the building was worth. Marguerite knew what the name was worth. Out-of-towners already asking, was this the Maman Odette's? They had a plan. And a plan between two sisters is a wall the third one just finds herself standing on the wrong side of. Mr. Pertwee opened the folder. He explained it the careful way lawyers do down here, because Louisiana isn't like anywhere else. He talked about the succession. He talked about how the estate would pass, the immovable property, meaning the building, the movable property, meaning everything in it, and the goodwill of the business, which is a lawyer's word for the thing you can't touch, but everybody's fighting over anyway. The name, the reputation. Maman Odette's. Then he read how our mother had left it. The building to Colette and Marguerite jointly. The restaurant name, the goodwill, the going business, to Colette and Marguerite jointly. The furnishings, the fixtures, the recipe cards taped up by the range, the whole working guts of the place. Colette and Marguerite. He turned a page. And to me, to Delphine, my mother left, and I'm going to give you his exact words, because I've carried them 30 years. All works of her hand and mind, written, together with her personal papers and books. The notebooks. The box of oilcloth notebooks with the dates at the top of every page, and the raised seals in the corners. That was my inheritance. That was the whole of it. Colette turned in her chair and looked at me. And here is the part I want you to see clearly, because it happened fast, and it never happened again in exactly this way, and I have replayed it 10,000 times. There was a cardboard box on the floor by Mr. Pertwee's desk. My mother's notebooks, packed up from the cypress table. Colette leaned down, and she pushed that box across the floor toward me with 2 fingers. 2 fingers, like she didn't want the rest of her hand involved. And she gave me a smile that was almost kind. Almost. And she said, "You always were the sentimental one, Del. You keep Mama's little diaries." A pause. That smile. "We'll keep the restaurant running. For her. For her. Like they were the ones honoring our mother. Like the box on the floor was a consolation prize for the girl who cried at the radio." Marguerite didn't say anything. Marguerite just gave me her front-of-house smile, the one she used on tourists, warm and complete, and meaning absolutely nothing. And she reached over and squeezed my hand once, the way you'd squeeze the hand of someone whose dog just died. And I understood what had happened. They believed, both of them, honestly, all the way down, that they had just kept everything of value and handed the baby a box of her mother's feelings. Now, here is what I knew, sitting in that chair, that neither one of my sisters knew. The recipe cards taped up by the range, the ones they'd just fought to keep, were copies. Splattered, half-legible copies my mother made off the notebooks so the working cooks wouldn't ruin the originals. The cards were the shadow. The notebooks were the thing casting it. Every recipe that made Maman Odette's worth a nickel, the roux, the étouffée, the gumbo, the bread pudding people drove in from Baton Rouge for. Every one of them existed in my mother's own hand, dated by her own hand, and stamped true by a notary on Rampart Street while I stood there as a girl and felt the raised ring under my thumb. My sisters had kept the building and the name and the shadow. They had just pushed the original, dated, sealed, and proven, across the floor to me with 2 fingers and called it a diary. I opened my mouth. I want you to know that. I opened my mouth to tell them, right there, in that hot little room, with the fan turning too slow, I felt the words come up. These aren't diaries. Do you know what these are? Do you know what Mama did on those Saturdays? Do you know what a seal on a dated page is worth in this state? And then I heard her. Don't you fight your sisters over me when I'm gone. Promise me that. I'd promised her. 2 weeks in the ground, and I'd already have broken it, in a lawyer's office, over money, on the worst possible day. Exactly the thing she'd looked at me across that cypress table and asked me not to do. So I closed my mouth. I reached down and I pulled the box the rest of the way to me, off Colette's 2 fingers, into my own 2 hands, and I held it in my lap, and I said, "Thank you. I'll take good care of Mama's books." Colette's smile got a little warmer, because that's what people do when you agree to be small for them. Marguerite squeezed my hand again. Everybody in that room thought they'd witnessed a sweet, sad little moment, the sentimental one, getting her sentimental little keepsake. Mr. Pertwee, though, Mr. Pertwee paused. He looked at that line in the will one more time. All works of her hand and mind, written. And I watched him almost say something. He was a careful man, and I think, for just a second, he wondered why a woman would phrase a keepsake that way. Works of her hand and mind, not her diaries, not her personal effects. Works. But my sisters were already standing, already gathering their pocketbooks, already talking about repainting the front room, and the moment closed over like water. He shut the folder. He said he was sorry for our loss. We went out into the wet Canal Street heat, and my sisters walked ahead of me, arm in arm, 2 women who'd just inherited a restaurant, and I walked behind them, carrying a cardboard box. In the car, before I drove home, I opened it. I lifted out the top notebook, and I let it fall open on my lap. And there, the first page I landed on, a recipe for oyster dressing, November 9th, underlined once, and down in the right corner, catching the light through the windshield, that raised ring pressed into the paper. I put my thumb on it. Same as when I was a girl. She thought she'd handed me my mother's diaries. What she'd actually handed me, dated, sealed, and signed, was the deed to everything she was about to build. It just took 30 years for anyone to read it. For 30 years, I carried other people's empty plates through the restaurant my mother built, and my own sisters told the tourists I was just the help. I want to explain how that happened, because people always ask it the same way, with the same little wrinkle between the eyebrows. Why would you go work there? Why would you bus tables in your own family's place, under your own sisters, after what they did? The plain answer is, I had to eat, and I knew that stove better than I knew my own hands. The truer answer is, I couldn't leave her. My mother was in that kitchen. Not her ghost, I don't mean it that way. I mean, the Trinity was cut the way she cut it, because I taught the new cook to do it. I mean, the roux went to chocolate and not peanut butter, because I stood behind that boy the first month and made him wait the 50 minutes a fool wouldn't wait through. I mean, the window fans still turned in the same corner, and the ferns still dripped on you in the same wrong spot on the balcony. To leave Maman Odette's would have been to leave the last warm room where my mother still existed. So I put on an apron, and I picked up a bus tub, and I stayed. Colette ran the money, Marguerite ran the front, and I ran the tubs. The invisibility came fast, faster than you'd think in a place your own name is on the sign. Within a year, the regulars stopped seeing me. Within 2, the tourists never saw me at all. I was the woman in the plain apron who took your dirty plates away and refilled your sweet tea and wiped the oilcloth down after you left. And you looked right through me, the way you look through a ceiling fan. I was part of the room. I was furniture that moved. And my sisters, I'll be fair. Mostly, they weren't cruel about it. Cruel would have been easier to hate. They were just practical. When a food writer or a tour group or a curious customer would ask about the family, Marguerite would light up and tell the story of 2 sisters carrying on their sainted mother's legacy. 2 sisters. And if I happened to be 3 feet away with a pitcher in my hand, well, I was the help. Why complicate a nice story with a 3rd sister in an apron? I told myself I didn't mind. That was a lie I got very good at telling. Here is the part where the story turns, though you couldn't have felt it turning at the time. It started small, the way these things do. Sometime in the early 80s, Colette came to me, pleasant, businesslike, and asked if she could borrow Mama's books for a minute, just to check a measurement. The cook they had then was arguing about the bread pudding, said it needed more egg, and Colette wanted to settle it against the original. Against the original. She said those exact words to me, holding out her hand for my box, and she didn't hear herself say it. Because to her, they were still diaries. She just wanted to win an argument about eggs. I gave her the notebook. What was I going to do, hide my mother's bread pudding from the restaurant it was born in? I gave it to her, and she checked the measurement, and she handed it back, and that was that. Except it wasn't. Because a thing that gets borrowed once gets borrowed again. Over the next years, it became a habit. A new cook, a forgotten ratio, a dish they wanted to bring back for a season, and Colette or Marguerite would come find me for Mama's books. And somewhere in there, and I remember the day I noticed it, they stopped borrowing the notebooks and started copying them. Marguerite sat at a front table one slow afternoon with my mother's gumbo notebook open in front of her and a fresh, clean binder beside it, and she copied, page after page, in her own hand, into a nice new binder with plastic sleeves, a master book for the kitchen, she called it, so the cooks would stop wearing out Mama's originals. I stood by the wait station with a tray of clean glasses, and I watched my sister transcribe our dead mother's dated, notarized recipes into a binder with her own name written on the front. And I understood something cold and clear. They were copying the writing. Not just the list of what goes in a pot. Anybody can put crab and okra and the Trinity on a shopping list, and the law will tell you nobody owns a shopping list. No, they were copying my mother's words, her exact instructions. Stir it till it lies still and dark. Salt the water, never the roux. Wait past when you think it's done, then wait once more. The little notes in the margins that were pure Odette, that were her voice on paper. That's not a shopping list. That's a woman's writing. And a woman's writing belongs to whoever she left it to. She left it to me. I didn't say a word. I set my glasses down. I went back to my tables. And that night, I went home, and I did the only thing I ever did about any of it for 30 years. I took the notebooks, the real ones, the originals, and I moved them out of the kitchen box they'd lived in, and I wrapped them in a clean, dry pillowcase, and I put them in a hat box on the top shelf of my closet, up where the damp couldn't reach, and where nobody borrowing Mama's books would ever go looking. I gave the restaurant the copies to wear out. I kept the originals safe. And I said nothing. Let me tell you what 30 years feels like, so you don't imagine it went by in a montage. It went by one shift at a time. Betsy was already history, and Katrina wasn't born yet. The quarter changed around us. The tourists came in bigger waves. The rents went up. The little neighborhood places started turning into names. Maman Odette's got a fresh coat of yellow paint. Then another. The green shutters got replaced with green shutters that looked just like the old ones, but weren't. My sisters got a little grayer and a lot richer. Colette got a car with leather seats. Marguerite got her teeth done and started wearing scarves, the way ladies do who summer somewhere. And I got older in the same apron, carrying the same tubs, refilling the same chicory coffee for people who never once wondered why the busser knew every recipe on the menu by heart. There was a night in the late 80s I've never forgotten. A food writer came in, a real one, from a magazine up north doing a piece on the grand dames of Creole cooking. He sat with my sisters at a front table for 2 hours. I was 3 feet away, refilling water, in and out, a shadow with a pitcher. And he asked them. He asked the exact question. He said, "These recipes, this incredible archive your mother left, who actually wrote them all down? Was there an original? Some record of where they came from?" And Colette looked at him and she said, "Oh, we did. Over the years. It's a family tradition. The women in our family have always written the recipes down." We did. I was standing right there, pitcher in my hand, 3 feet away. I set the pitcher down on the wait station. Slow. I didn't slam it. I just set it down. And I said nothing. That was the closest I ever came. That was the night, if there was ever going to be a night, that I'd have opened that hat box in my mind and pulled out the truth and laid it on that food writer's table. We did? Sister, you copied every word of that out of a binder you copied out of a notebook that's in my closet with a notary's seal in the corner and a date older than your marriage. I didn't say it. You want to know why I didn't say it after all that? 2 reasons, and I'll give you both honest. The first was my mother. Don't you fight your sisters over me. I'd promised, and 30 years is a long time to keep a promise, but a promise doesn't get smaller with time. If anything, it gets heavier, and you get more stubborn about it, because by then, it's most of who you are. The second reason is the one people don't like as much, so I'll say it plain. I knew. I already knew what I had. I didn't need a food writer, and I didn't need a fight. My mother taught me a thing at that cypress table when I was 10 years old, and I finally understood it somewhere in my 40s. A date doesn't lie. You don't have to shout down a lie. You don't have to wrestle it. You just have to keep the true thing safe and dated, and wait. Because a lie is a thing that lives on borrowed time, and one day, the note comes due. So I wasn't sitting on those notebooks out of weakness. Understand that. A woman who's weak gives the box away or throws it out. I kept it. Dry, dated, sealed, on the top shelf for 30 years. That's not weakness. That's patience wearing the costume of weakness, which is a thing my sisters never learned to tell apart. And it cost them everything. There was one time I made sure. Just once. In the early 90s, I took an afternoon and I went and sat with an old lawyer, a friend of a friend, and I brought 1 page, just one, the Crawfish Étouffée, March 14th, the one I'd watched her date when I was a girl. I laid it on his desk and I asked him, "Careful, hypothetical. If a woman wrote something like this and dated it and had it notarized back in the 70s, and somebody else printed it and sold it years later, whose is it? He picked it up. He felt the seal with his thumb, same as I always did. And he told me, in plain words, the thing I'd half known since I was 10. He said a recipe as a list. Nobody owns that. But a recipe as writing, the actual words, the way she said it, the notes, the arrangement, all of it in her own hand. That's a work. That belongs to whoever wrote it, and notarized and dated decades before anybody else's version? Ma'am, he said, that's not a diary. That's the earliest proof of authorship I've ever held in my hand. Whoever owns these owns the writing under anything built from them. Don't you lose them. I said I wouldn't. I put the page back in the pillowcase, back in the hat box, back on the shelf. I went back to work the next morning. I picked up a bus tub, and I told not one living soul what that lawyer said. Not my sisters, not a food writer, not anybody, for another decade. People ask me later why I never said a word for 30 years. The truth is simple. My mother didn't raise me to fight for what was mine. She raised me to write it down, date it, and wait. So I waited. In 1994, my sisters put my mother's handwriting on the cover of a book and sold it in every airport in Louisiana, and my name wasn't in it anywhere. They called it Maman Odette's, the original Creole kitchen, and they made the cover look like her. That's the part that stopped my breath the first time I saw it in a store window on Decatur. They'd taken her cursive, that tight, even, blue-black hand, and printed it big across the front, the title written out like she'd written it herself, like she was reaching up out of the ground to sign her own book. The original, right there on the cover. A word that meant nothing to the people buying it, and meant everything to the woman in the apron who'd bought her copy and carried it home in a paper sack like something she'd stolen. Because I had to see it. I had to know what was inside. I sat down at my own kitchen table that night, and I opened the cookbook, and I got up and I took the hat box down off the closet shelf, and I unwrapped the pillowcase, and I set my mother's notebook open on the table, right beside the printed book. And I read them together, line by line. I want to be precise about what I found, because everything that came later hangs on it, and because most people don't understand the difference until you show it to them. If my sisters had just printed a list, a pound of shipments, a cup of flour, the Trinity, salt, I'd have had nothing. Nobody owns a grocery list. The law's clear as glass on that. A recipe, stripped down to its ingredients and its bare steps, is what the lawyers call a procedure. And a procedure belongs to everybody. Colette could have sold shrimp and okra in this order until the day she died, and I couldn't have said a word. That's not what she did. She printed my mother's words. I sat there and I read it. The gumbo recipe in the book didn't just say, cook the roux until dark. It said, and I'm reading you the printed page now, stir it till it lies still and dark, and don't you look away, because the color will lie to you the second you do. That's not a procedure. That's my mother. That's her exact voice, her exact words, the thing she said to me every morning of my childhood with her back turned at the range. They'd copied it, word for word, into a book with a copyright line at the front and a price on the back. The étouffée said, salt the water, never the roux. Hers, her words. The bread pudding had her little joke in it. If the top don't crack, you rushed it, and the Lord sees a rushed dessert. That was Odette on a page, 30 years dead, cracking her same joke into a cookbook her youngest daughter had to buy in an airport gift shop. They didn't steal a recipe. You can't steal a recipe. They stole her writing, and her writing had an owner, and it wasn't the two names on the cover. But here's the thing that made my hands go cold. Here's the thing I sat with at that table until the coffee went stone cold beside me. The mistake. Back in 1974, I'd watched her do it. I remembered it. My mother made an error in one recipe, the oyster dressing. She'd written the sage measurement wrong, wrote a tablespoon where she meant a teaspoon, and she caught it later and put a little correction in the margin, in her own hand. No, teaspoon. Too much sage will bully the oyster. The corrected margin note. Pure Odette, and there it was, in the printed book. Not the correction, the mistake. Whoever copied it, Marguerite, in her binder, years back, had copied the wrong measurement off the page and never seen the margin note, and it had gone from the notebook to Marguerite's binder to a typesetter to a printing press into airports across the state of Louisiana. A tablespoon of sage where a teaspoon belonged. You understand what that is? That's a fingerprint. That's the one thing in the whole book that proves, beyond any argument any lawyer could ever mount, that the printed page was copied from my mother's notebook, because the only place on this earth that exact mistake existed was one dated, notarized page in a hat box on my closet shelf. Nobody invents the same wrong measurement by accident. A lie can copy the truth. It just can't help copying the truth's mistakes along with it. I closed the cookbook. I wrapped the notebook back in the pillowcase. I put the hat box back on the shelf. And I went to work the next morning and bussed tables, same as ever. And I said nothing. The book was a hit. I'll give my sisters that. They knew how to sell. Marguerite did the radio, did a little local television, sat in that front room in a good scarf and talked about our mother's original recipes written down over the years by the women of our family. Colette handled the money, and there was a lot of money now. They licensed the name. A spice company put out a Maman Odette's seasoning blend. There was talk, real talk, of a second location, then a third, then, and this is where a good story turns into a cautionary one, of franchising. Of putting the name Maman Odette's on kitchens in Baton Rouge and Lafayette and clear over into Mississippi. Of turning my mother's 12-table townhouse into a chain. And to do that, you need money up front. More money than even a hit cookbook throws off. So around the turn of the century, 1999-2000, my sisters went to a bank. I know how this part works now because of what came after. So let me tell it to you the way I understand it today, sitting here, and not the way I half understood it then, rinsing glasses behind a counter. When a business borrows big money to expand, the bank wants collateral, something to hold on to if it all goes wrong. And when the business is a brand, when the thing that's actually valuable isn't the building or the stoves, but the name and the recipes and the book, then that's what the bank takes as security. The intellectual property, the cookbook, the trademark. My sisters pledged the whole Maman Odette's brand, the name, the book, the recipes, all of it, as collateral against a loan big enough to build a chain. And a bank, before it lends against a thing, is supposed to make sure the borrower actually owns the thing. But a brand is a slippery thing to own. A name, a book, a reputation. It's not like a building where there's a deed in the courthouse with your name on it. And so a room full of bankers looked at Maman Odette's, the original Creole kitchen, saw two proud, well-dressed sisters whose mother's face was practically the logo, saw the sales numbers, and asked the easy questions. Who owns the trademark? You do. Who published the book? You did. Fine. Sign here. Not one of them asked the only question that mattered. Not one of them asked, who owns the writing under all this? Who wrote the words in this book? Where did they come from? Is there an original, dated, signed, proven? And does it belong to the two names on this contract or to somebody else? Nobody asked. Why would they? The sentimental one was 3 parishes over in an apron, invisible, carrying a bus tub, and she'd been invisible so long even the bankers couldn't see her. I found out about the loan the way I found out everything, quietly, sideways, from a supplier chatting at the back door. Big expansion coming, bank money, the sisters going national. And I stood there in the alley behind the kitchen with a case of tomatoes in my arms, and I felt something I'd never let myself feel in 30 years. Not anger. I'd made my peace with anger a long time back. It was more like the ground shifting. The thing my mother told me at 10 years old, coming true in slow motion right in front of me. Because my sisters had just borrowed millions of dollars against a brand built entirely on my mother's written words. Words they didn't own. Words that traced back through a copied mistake to a notarized page in a hat box on my closet shelf. They'd pledged, as collateral, a thing that was never fully theirs to pledge. They'd built a tower on a foundation that had somebody else's name notarized into the bottom of it. And I could have stopped it. That day, in the alley, tomatoes in my arms, I could have gone to a lawyer, gone to that bank, laid the page on the table, and blown the whole thing up before it got built. I didn't. I set the tomatoes down in the kitchen. I tied my apron. I went back to my tables. Because my mother didn't raise me to knock a thing down. She raised me to write the truth, date it, and wait for the lie to fall down on its own. And I could feel, standing in that alley, that it had finally started leaning. They borrowed millions against my mother's handwriting, and not one banker in that room ever asked the only question that mattered. Who actually owned the hand that wrote it? The call came on a Tuesday, while I was drying glasses behind the counter, and the man on the phone asked if he was speaking to the sole surviving author of the Maman Odette's recipes. But I have to tell you what happened first, or the phone call won't mean anything. The chain never worked. It went up too fast on too much borrowed money, the way those things do. A second location, then a third, a fourth clear over in Mississippi, and every one of them was Maman Odette's, the way a photograph of a person is that person. The name was there. The book was on every table. But my mother wasn't standing at any of those stoves, waiting the 50 minutes a fool wouldn't wait through. And neither was I. And you can taste that. Somewhere around the third location, the roux started coming out peanut butter, and the reviews started saying, not what it used to be. And the sisters kept borrowing to fix it, which is the oldest mistake there is. Borrowing money to hide the fact that you're losing money. And then it was 2005, and you know what came in 2005. The water came. And the water didn't care whose name was on the sign. 2 of the locations flooded out. The tourists stopped coming to a city half underwater, and a business that was already leaning got shoved, hard, all at once. By the fall of that year, Maman Odette's, the whole thing, the chain, the name, the brand my sisters had spent 30 years building on our mother's back, filed for bankruptcy. It made the Times-Picayune, a little story, back pages, the kind you'd miss. Beloved Creole brand seeks protection from creditors. I read it standing up in my kitchen with my coffee, and I felt no joy in it. I want you to believe that. There was no joy. 2 of those locations flooding was 2 kitchens full of people out of work. And one of them was the original, the townhouse, my mother's 12 tables. I didn't want it underwater. I never wanted any of it underwater. But bankruptcy isn't just a business dying. Bankruptcy is a business getting taken apart and looked at, piece by piece, by people whose whole job is to figure out what everything is really worth and who really owns it. That's the part my sisters never understood was coming. Because when a company that borrowed against its brand goes bankrupt, the bank wants its collateral. It wants the thing it was promised. And here, the thing it was promised wasn't a building. The buildings were flooded and mortgaged anyway. The thing the bank had lent millions against was the intellectual property. The name, the book, the recipes. That was the collateral. That was what the bank was owed. And before a bank can seize a thing, before a bankruptcy court will hand it over, somebody has to prove the company actually owns it. So the bank sent a lawyer, not to the kitchens, to the paperwork. An intellectual property lawyer whose whole job was to go down into the foundation of the Maman Odette's brand and confirm, on paper, that the company had clean title to the most valuable thing it had left, the recipes and the book pledged as security. And that lawyer did the thing not one banker had ever done in 1999. He asked the question, where did the writing come from? Is there an original? He pulled the copyright on the book. He pulled the succession, my mother's will, filed away in Mr. Pertwis's old records for 30 years. And he read a line that no one had thought about since the day it was read aloud, in a hot little office off Canal Street. All works of her hand and mind, written, together with her personal theaters and books. To Delphine. Not to Colette. Not to Marguerite. To Delphine. And then, I found all this out later, in pieces. He did the thing that finished it. He compared. He took the printed book and he started matching it against whatever originals he could trace, looking for the source of the writing. And somewhere in there, he found what I'd found at my kitchen table years before. The oyster dressing. A tablespoon of sage where a teaspoon belonged. The mistake. The fingerprint. Proof. Cold, mechanical, unarguable proof that the printed, monetized, pledged to the bank writing had been copied from an earlier original. An original that belonged, by a dead woman's own words, to her youngest daughter. The one nobody had asked about in 30 years. So he asked about her now. That's how a Tuesday in the fall of 2005 became the day the phone rang behind the counter of a little diner where I'd taken a shift, and a man's voice, careful and professional, said, "I'm trying to reach Delphine Boudreau. Am I speaking with Delphine Boudreau?" I said he was. He said, "Ma'am, I represent the bank in the Maman Odette's bankruptcy. I have some questions about the ownership of the recipes at the center of it. We have reason to believe you may be the legal owner of the intellectual property in this case." I was holding a glass and a dish towel. I set the glass down on the counter. Slow. I didn't set it down hard. I just set it down, the way I'd set down a pitcher 3 feet from a food writer a lifetime ago. And the room got very quiet, and the whole 30 years stood up in it, the box pushed across the floor with 2 fingers, the pillowcase, the hat box on the top shelf, the copied mistake, the sisters in their scarves saying, "We did." The 50 minutes a fool wouldn't wait through. The man on the phone was still talking, asking if the recipes still existed, if there was documentation, if I would be willing to speak with them. I let him finish. And then I told him the truth. The only thing I've ever really had. The thing my mother handed me across a cypress table when I was 10 years old. I said, I know. He paused. He said, I'm sorry, you know. I said, I've known for 30 years. My mother dated every page, and she had them notarized. A pause. You want to see the originals, sir? You come to New Orleans. They've never left my closet. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, very carefully, that he thought that would be a good idea. I hung up the phone, and I looked out through the pass into the dining room, and there, because life will do this to you, there at a table by the window were my two sisters, older now, grayer now, having lunch the way they still did, laughing at something, in a city they were losing a business in, not knowing, not yet, that a phone had just rung, and that after 30 years of asking me nothing but whether the table wanted more coffee, a bankruptcy lawyer had just asked me if I owned the most famous recipes in New Orleans. I told him the truth. I said yes. The notarized page. I wore my mother's coat to that meeting, the good one she kept for church, and I brought one page in a paper folder. That was all it took. It was a few weeks later in a lawyer's office downtown, nothing like the hot little room off Canal Street where this all started 30 years before. This one had glass walls and a long table so polished you could see the ceiling lights in it. There was the bank's lawyer, the one who'd called me. There was a man from the court, the trustee, the one whose job it was to take my sister's company apart and pay back what could be paid. And there was Colette. And there was Marguerite. They'd been told the owner of the recipes had been found. They had not been told who. So when I walked in my mother's church coat, the one with the good buttons, that still smelled faintly of the closet and faintly, if you knew to look for it, of a kitchen, my sisters looked up, and for one long second, they didn't understand. Then Colette's face rearranged itself into something almost relieved, almost warm, and she said, Oh, Del, honey, did they call you as a witness? Come sit. A witness. Even then, even walking into that room, I was the help to her. The sentimental one they'd bring in to say a few nice words about Mama. I didn't correct her. I've never been one to correct a person who's about to correct themselves. I sat. I set my paper folder on that polished table, and the bank's lawyer began to explain, carefully, the way careful men do, why we were all there. He said the company had pledged its intellectual property, the name, the book, the recipes, as collateral. He said before the bank could take that collateral, the court had to confirm the company owned it clean. And he said that in doing that work, they had traced the ownership of the writing back to its source. Then he looked at me, and he nodded, just slightly, the way you nod at someone to say, go ahead. I opened the paper folder, and I took out one page. One, a single sheet of oilcloth notebook paper, swollen a little with 30 years of Louisiana damp, the edges gone soft and brown. My mother's oyster dressing. And I laid it flat on that shining table, in the middle, where everyone could see it. At the top, in blue-black fountain pen, in her tight, even hand, the date, 1974, underlined once. Down in the corner, catching the ceiling lights, raised right up out of the paper so you could put your thumb on it and feel it. The notary's seal, and beside it, the bank's lawyer laid down their copy of Maman Odette's, the original Creole kitchen, open to the oyster dressing. He said, read the sage measurement, Pageleys, in both. Colette read it. and I watched her read it. Because there it was, in my mother's hand, dated 1974, notarized. A tablespoon of sage. And there it was in the printed book, 30 years later. A tablespoon of sage. The same mistake. The same exact wrong measurement in the same exact place that existed nowhere on this earth, except on the page in front of her, and in a book that had been copied from it. The lawyer said it plain, for the room. He said a recipe as a list of ingredients. Nobody owns that. But this, the actual writing, my mother's words, her instructions, her notes, arranged in her own hand. This was a work. And this work was dated and notarized decades before the book was ever printed, which made my mother the proven author. And the will, filed 30 years ago, never contested, left all works of her hand and mind written to one person. He said my name. Delphine Boudreau. He said the writing at the very bottom of the whole Maman Odette's brand, the thing the entire company had been pledged against, did not belong to the company. It never had. It belonged to me. And I watched my sister's face do the thing I'd waited 30 years without ever letting myself wait for. Colette's smile fell off. It didn't fade. It fell all at once, the way a plate falls. And her hand came down flat on that polished table, palm down, fingers spread, not reaching for anything, just steadying herself, the way you brace when the floor moves. Marguerite said it. Of course it was Marguerite who said it, the one who was always good with words. She said, quiet, almost to herself. But those were just her diaries. And the lawyer looked at her, and he wasn't cruel about it. He was just true. And he said, "No, ma'am. Those were the originals." And the room went silent. That real silence, the kind with weight in it, the kind you could have heard a seal press into paper across. Then the trustee cleared his throat, and he said there was one more thing. Because I owned the underlying work, because every dollar that brand had ever earned, the book, the license, the seasoning blend, all of it, had been built on writing that was legally mine, the value that could still be salvaged out of the wreck, the rights themselves, didn't flow to the bank the way the bank had planned. They flowed to the proven owner. To me. The one asset that survived the flood and the debt and the collapse, my mother's words, had never belonged to the people who lost everything else. It had been sitting in a hat box on my closet shelf the whole time. I want to be careful how I say the next part, because people always want me to make it sound like revenge, and it wasn't. My sisters lost the company. They did. But I didn't take it from them. Understand that. The bank didn't take it because I schemed. The bankruptcy was their own. The borrowing was their own. The flood was nobody's. All the truth did, at the very end, was land where it had always belonged. They lost the building and the name and the chain because they'd built it on borrowed money and somebody else's words. And both of those debts came due in the same year. That's not punishment. That's just a bill, arriving. I didn't say I told you so. I want you to hear that, because it's the part I'm proudest of, and it's the part that would have broken my mother's heart if I'd done otherwise. I reached across that shining table, and I picked up my one page, dated, sealed, soft at the edges, and I slid it back into the paper folder, and I folded the folder closed over my heart, into the inside pocket of my mother's church coat. And I stood up, and I looked at my two sisters, And I didn't gloat, and I didn't cry. And I said the only thing that was true, the thing I'd carried since I was 10 years old at a cypress table, watching a woman underline a date. I said, "She always knew one of you would try. That's why she dated everything." And I walked out. The old woman stopped there and picked up my empty coffee cup, and for a second I didn't understand why her hands were shaking a little. I'd been so far inside the story that I'd forgotten where I was, a small diner near Esplanade, one warm bulb over the counter, the street still wet outside. I had a page of notes I'd stopped taking somewhere around the phone call. I looked at her, this woman with flour worked so deep into her knuckles it had stopped washing out. And I asked the only thing left to ask. I said, "What happened to her? The third sister, the one who bussed the tables." She didn't answer me, not with words. She turned around to the little stove behind the counter, and she reached down and she turned a knob, and a burner caught with a soft blue ring of flame. And she took a battered pot off the shelf and set it on the fire. Slow. The way a person does a thing their hands have done 10,000 times and stopped needing the mind at all. And that's when I saw it. All of it, at once. The way you understand a thing you should have understood an hour ago. The coat on the hook by the door, a good coat, a church coat, old. The specials board on the wall, and today's date written up in the corner of it, in tight, even, blue-black cursive, out of a habit older than I was. The way she'd said at the bottom of my mother's stove, and I'd thought it was just a nice way to talk. She wasn't telling me a story about the third sister. She was the third sister, Delphine, sitting across from me the whole time. The woman who inherited nothing anyone could see, and turned out to be holding everything. She saw me get it. She smiled, a small, private smile, the kind that doesn't need a witness. And she stirred her pot, with her back half to me. And she said, "You want the honest ending, sugar? I didn't rebuild anything. I let the name die with the debt. I didn't want a chain. I never did." She tapped the spoon on the rim. One tap. I took my mother's words back home, and I opened one small room. And I cook out of her notebooks. And every morning I date the board. Force of habit. A date doesn't lie. I asked about her sisters. She said they were still living, that there'd been a kind of peace between them later. Quiet, imperfect, the kind you don't put in the magazine. No revenge. "I never needed them ruined," she said. "I just needed the truth to sit down in the right lap." And it did. Took 30 years. But it did. Then she looked at me, and past me, at whoever's listening. If you've ever been the one they overlooked, the quiet one, the one carrying everyone else's empty plates while somebody louder took the credit, then you already know what my mother knew. The truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be written down and dated, and patient enough to wait. Tell me in the comments, who in your life was the quiet one, the one everybody underestimated, who turned out to be holding everything all along? I'd like to read about them. I've got the coffee on.